Hello and welcome back to our lectures on the Exalted Treatise on the Response of the Tao. Today we will be focusing on this particular sentence, which states to reward the undeserving and punish the innocent. And obviously these are both misdeeds. So firstly, rewarding the undeserving. Generally, when we look at both of these things, there's two sentences here. Rewarding generally is to recognize and acknowledge and give credit to those who have performed well, to individuals who provide exemplary behavior, service, and performance. And not only does this encourage that particular individual, but also it helps others to learn what is appropriate, and it helps others to then know what to emulate exemplary behavior. If the leader then rewards the undeserving, so rewards clearly poor behavior, inadequate and inappropriate behavior, then this harms those who are meant to be deserving of that particular reward and acknowledgement, but also it does worse in that it actually encourages wrongful conduct. So rewarding the undeserving actually has quite far-reaching consequences. Similarly, punishing the innocent. So punishment is meant to deter wrongful behavior. And not only is it meant to deter wrongful behavior in one individual, but it's also meant to help others learn what to avoid, to caution others and send out the message that this is not to be tolerated. If one punishes the innocent, then clearly this sends out the wrong message. And this situation, in a way, is similar to actually rewarding the undeserving. Now, this sounds strange. How can the two cases be similar? Well, if we think about it, in both cases, all parties are ultimately harmed. First and foremost, the leader is not fulfilling their responsibility. Clearly states here in the Exalted Treatise that this is a misdeed. So as a leader who has that ability, that power to reward or punish, if they are rewarding and punishing inappropriately, then they're not fulfilling their duty. This is a misdeed which will lead to misfortune. On the other hand, the person who is wrongly punished is obviously also harmed. It then leads to deep-seated grievances. The person who is wrongly rewarded, they may not initially feel harmed in any way, but actually they learn to continue in their bad behavior. And then ultimately, everyone else who sees this inappropriate reward or punishment then learns the wrong standards, and those who are aware of the right standards would disapprove and lose confidence in the leader. So at the end of the day, everyone loses out, and that all comes about through the inappropriate rewarding and punishing from the leader themselves. So you can see how this misdeed has far-reaching consequences. And when we think about this so-called leader, obviously the first thing that comes to mind in terms of this idea of punishment is a justice in the law of court. But actually, this leader can be any role, any person that has a role that requires judgment and has a role that has this authority to mete out punishment or provide reward, and even simply praise and blame. So if we think about it, if we expand our understanding of the so-called leader, actually in the 5 categories of human relations, according to Confucian framework, actually in most of these relationships, you'll see that the senior role has the ability to provide some sort of supervision and evaluation of the more junior role. So, for example, even parents, how they praise or punish or blame their children affects that child, and also sets an example for the rest of the family. As an older sibling, you also have that authority. And more importantly, of course, in any work relationship, in any professional relationship, whether you're a manager or even just simply leading a team, like a medical team, in the sense that you have that responsibility to supervise and also give feedback, and provide the right performance criteria to the rest of the team. So as the common saying goes, with great power comes great responsibility. The responsibility is to be clear about the standards. And in fact, we can see that this not only has an impact on ourselves, our own misdeeds. We can either rack up the merits or demerits, but clearly it has an impact on everyone in the team as well. So, as I said here, it makes me think of actually other professions. So not just in any sort of work team relationship, but actually, very interestingly, any other profession that requires some sort of supervision. So as a teacher in the education profession, whether you're teaching at a primary, secondary, or tertiary level, but also even in media, the power of the written word to praise or blame others. Any form of writing, any form of media in which your words have an impact on the public. This is something that we also have to take into account. Are we rewarding, praising the undeserving, and blaming or punishing those who are innocent? So it's important to think about this sentence broadly. So the main question then is, what should we value? Because reward and punishment is based on certain criteria or standards. And I want to sort of explore with you two different scenarios. The first is if there is an objective criteria or performance indicators in the workplace. How is it that we go about implementing that if we are in that kind of a position, if we have that role? So, for example, as a teacher, if you have marking criteria, for example. If there is that marking criteria, that assessment criteria, then what is preventing impartiality? Because even if there is some sort of marking criteria, there also is quite a large scope and judgment and leeway. So what's getting in the way of providing an accurate kind of mark? And then the second scenario is if there's not no seeming objective criteria. So this might be outside of the workplace, outside of some sort of clear performance-related conduct or behavior. Okay, so there's two scenarios here, because as we saw before, this kind of praise and blame, reward or punishment actually extends beyond the workplace, beyond schools, and throughout all our lives, even within the family, where sometimes it seems that there's no objective criteria. So what do you do? Now, in order to, what we'll do is we'll first explore when there is some sort of objective criteria. And in order to do that, I particularly want to draw from the records, the ancient records, and the lessons of the past, and in particular, the famous Emperor Taizong of the Tang Dynasty. And the text that I will be using is called The Essentials of Governance, and it was compiled in around the 6th century. And it's basically a collection of dialogues between Emperor Taizong, considered one of the most eminent emperors in imperial China, who ruled over a time in China that was deemed to be quite a golden era, a period of great stability and prosperity for the Tang or Chinese Empire. So this was he ruled in around the 7th century, and his ministers, therefore, in their conversations, of course, it sort of brings together his considerations at the time, his policies. So very interesting that this particular text, The Essentials of Governance, was then used for the education of emperors, political elites, and general readers throughout the rest of imperial China, but also in other parts of East Asia. So, for example, Japan, Korea, and it became quite a standard reference work for understanding political thought, statecraft. And very recently, an English translation was published. So this is what I'll be using today, and taking out a few scenarios that might help us get our heads around, as the ruler, as Emperor Taizong, what were his considerations in terms of reward and punishment? So, someone who has great authority, the highest position in the empire, and what does he do with that? How does he bring to bear this authority, despite the chaos as he was at the beginning of his reign, but also then how we can see the results of his reign was such that there was this stability in what was known as the Jingguan era. And how did that come about? So it's quite useful then to look back at what he did, learn from those lessons, and think about, well, how does it affect our life? So in this first excerpt, this occurs in the 16th year of his reign. So Jingguan refers to the name of his reign period, and in brackets there is the year. So it was in 642. So very clearly recorded these sort of court conversations. Now, in this particular conversation, Emperor Taizong has been worried for some time, you could say, about the impartiality of judicial reviews. So what's happening in the courts, and whether or not reward and punishment, the sentencing has been impartial. So he says to the chief minister of the court of judicial review, he first begins with this analogy, and it's an analogy that actually comes from the Mencius. He says that there are clearly two professions. One is a profession that makes shields, and as a result, they want to ensure that their shields are impenetrable. So their aim is to prevent people from becoming injured. On the other hand, someone who is in the profession of making arrows, their sole purpose and their sole focus is to make those arrows sharp so that they can kill others, that they can injure others. So two professions that are in the same industry, so the weapon industry, you'd say the armaments industry, and yet they have two very different areas of focus, you could say. Two very different objectives. One is to kill, one is to protect. And says, why is that? And because each has their task, each interest lies in fulfilling that task. So they have this tunnel vision. They're only focused on that one point to the exclusion of other things, of course. And he uses this then as an analogy. What's the analogy? He says that, well, when we ask of officials of the court or, in the prison system, so officials in the prison system, in the legal system, obviously the point is to ask them to focus on providing fair judgment and justice, right? So sometimes we can see that punishments can be light or heavy. So there can be tougher sentencing or lighter sentences, for example. And it seems that these people who are in that court system, the people they come into contact with every day, is a very sort of skewed proportion of the population. So the people that they see every day are really, these criminals, maybe repeat offenders, etc. So they have this bias, and as a result, their focus then is to crack down on those repeat offenders, to crack down on people who may not, in their eyes, not have been punished too lightly and therefore keep coming back. So their focus is to be more to seek harsher disciplines, harsher sentences and punishments. And so here Taizong is saying, well, we fear that the interest of the officials in charge of the prisons lies in killing people and endangering others. This is very interesting, isn't it? Because then he says, well, why do they do that? It's because to advance themselves and to gain a reputation. So clearly, if you're working in that system, perhaps it improves your reputation to show that you are more strict and disciplined, and you're not lenient in letting these improper behavior go in a way. And the discipline, this idea of cracking down and being strict on those criminals, then improves your reputation. So that is what is getting in the way of impartiality, isn't it? That their own reputation, they put their career advancement and also their reputations ahead of what is just, and ultimately the lives of these prisoners, the lives of others. And I guess in our everyday situation, we may not be in any way related to the legal system, but there are also simple things that we can think of within different professions. I remember talking to a secondary school teacher, and obviously a large part of that work is very much about marking homework, providing sort of marking assessments, etc. And she was telling me that she was quite surprised at the lack of language ability of her students. The fact that they've started year 9, and yet she felt that their language abilities were probably year 7. And she was, you could say, quite concerned that they could have passed all of the exams in the previous levels and yet have such poor ability. And it was, she told me that she came to the conclusion that maybe the teachers in the lower years felt that it was easier to simply pass those students than to have to fill out extra paperwork and I guess face appeals from students or complaints from parents, or even to complete additional paperwork when their line manager, their head teacher, then asks them why they decided to fail the student. So that idea then is very clear, isn't it? That it's not simply about what the student has done and their competency in providing that very clear feedback at that level, but actually more thinking about, the not filling out that paperwork, not having to do the extra work of having to justify oneself and really sort of create more work for themselves. And that might be the case or the consideration for one particular individual in the education system. But it was quite clear from my discussions with my friend that, imagine that if every teacher from the level of primary school to secondary school to even university just thinks about the bottom line and thinks about, the idea that we want to keep the students because of perhaps income. And, if you think about that, then the consequences on that scale would be quite dramatic, in the sense that what would be the standard of graduates if that happens? And what abilities would they be able to offer to contribute to society, even if they do come out with some sort of degree? So, and all of this comes about because each individual along that person's educational journey has to make that decision as to whether to be really honest, or impartial, or simply just to think of themselves, to think of the student, or to think of their own job being on the line. And then ultimately having the ability, but also that responsibility to invest the time and energy and effort to develop that student. So this idea of, marking assessments when and providing marks just so that students can get over the line, that is something that would be in that category of rewarding the undeserving. So not only does that, as we mentioned, not only does that harm that particular student, that individual, but also other students would see this and say, well, what's the point of working hard when everyone just can pass anyway? So no one really bothers to put in that effort. And, that is on the teacher-student relationship. But on another level, it's the head of that institution not really punishing the innocent in a way, not providing the right appropriate credit for those who are doing the right thing, and punishing those who are actually being honest and being accurate. So this is, we're trying to sort of think about what Emperor Taizong had to face when he was trying to achieve some sort of impartiality in the first few years of his reign, and ensuring that, the population at large he was being accountable to the rest of the population. But from the modern perspective, in that profession of education or any other sort of supervisory profession, it is important to provide that honest appraisal, and not be thinking about one's personal interests. The next particular excerpt looks at a different element that can hinder one's impartiality. So in the very first year of his reign, it was said that someone submitted a memorial. So basically memorials are letters to the emperor, sort of providing personal opinions, suggestions, etc. for policy. And this particular suggestion was that long-serving troops, so troops, officials that had been serving Taizong even before he became emperor. So these people obviously had been with him for a long time, had supported him for a long time. Well, the suggestion was that they should be appointed to military posts, and also be part of the imperial guard. So essentially be promoted and be given automatically given roles in the government now that he had become the emperor. What was his reaction to this? That his long-serving troops should automatically get positions. Taizong said that the whole realm is our family, so we shouldn't be partial to just the people who served us prior to us becoming the emperor. So the main consideration is talent. So we cannot make distinctions according to the duration of the relationship that we've had. And if it was based on simply the duration, someone's long serving, then these people who do not have any talent will fill up the ranks. They're incompetent, unable to make the right decisions. People would lose confidence in the government, in the military, and therefore this would, not be very conducive to his reign. So he says, your proposal adds nothing to governance, and he didn't really accept that proposal. So you can see that he's very clear about who he rewards. And this is something that he said in the beginning of his reign, when he wanted to make sure that everyone was very clear. But did he follow through on it? Here in the 9th year, we see that this particular commander-in-chief, Gao Zengsheng, was guilty of disobeying the military commissioner, Li Jing. So it was the background for Zengsheng is that he was actually a meritorious official, so someone who contributed quite a lot before Taizong became the emperor. He was part of the household of the Prince of Qing, so this was Taizong before he became emperor. And someone said that this Gao Zengsheng should be treated with leniency because of his background. So actually, because he disobeyed the military commissioner, the punishment was the death penalty. But in fact, very fortunately, that death penalty was commuted, and he was instead banished to the frontiers, which is quite interesting because he's already the death penalty was already commuted, and yet people were saying that he should be treated even more leniently because of his former history, his long service. Well, what does Taizong say to this? He says, Zengsheng disobeyed Li Jing, and he was also falsely accused Li Jing of plotting treason. So actually, he had 2 accounts of two offences. And yes, he did gain merit in the household in the past, and that should not be forgotten. But in administering this state and upholding the laws, one has to be consistent as the leader. So then he sort of explains to the person who, I guess, provided some opposition or dissent on his particular decision, says, well, if I was to treat him with leniency, then what happened? Well, he might think that he could get away with anything, right? And that would mean that that particular individual, Gao Zengsheng, would then become more brazen. He might actually rebel or, etc., thinking that he would never be punished. And on top of that, others would be jealous. Others would think, well, he's his 2 offences are actually quite serious and merit the death penalty, but you've completely acquitted him, then it's like there's no justice. And everyone that might be in his position, the position of having served for a long period of time, might think that they are immune to the law, and then they might violate the law. So basically, it sets a wrong example. So it's not just about this particular person, but anyone in that situation would also learn the wrong principles that that this long service, that one's history, one's former contributions and merits is enough to justify anything and would protect them from any kind of offence. Well, that's clearly not the case. So it says here, there must be consistency in all affairs. So yes, he was meritorious in the past, which might have been the reason for him being promoted, maybe having a particular position. And obviously that would have been because he had the right talent. But if in that particular position he commits an offence, then he needs to be treated like everyone else to ensure that there is impartiality. So you can see here that something that gets in the way of impartiality. Clearly, Taizong had the right idea, but even the people that were close to him, his senior ministers, were partial in the sense that they thought that long service and history could protect them from any kind of crime. So this is the thing, isn't it? One of the and it brings out the other element to what might be preventing us from actually providing accurate and impartial praise and blame, reward and punishment, is that if we know someone over a long period of time, then that emotion gets in the way. We read of Confucius in the Analects really treasuring old friendships, right? And sometimes I think it was in the school sayings of Confucius, another ancient text in which Confucius is one of his friends is found to be quite eccentric and not according with ritual propriety, you could say. And his students say, well, ask Confucius, should you sort of end the relationship, end the friendship, because clearly he's not setting the right examples. And Confucius says that no, he's an old friend. So how is that, Confucius valuing old friendships different from this particular instance in which Taizong says, well, we cannot pardon someone simply because of their previous merit or whether they followed us since the very beginning. The difference is that friendships are friendships, and it's important to always think about the kindnesses of others and what they've done for us. But if that friendship gets in the way of good governance, in the sense that this person, if they are appointed to a particular position, they have to uphold this professional ethical behavior and standards. And if they're unable to do so, if they don't have the capabilities, then it means, of course, that everyone below them, their subordinates, their team members, the community, the public, would be affected by their example, by their actions. So that's why Emperor Taizong was very well renowned for appointing talented and virtuous officials and ministers who really sort of laid the foundations for his very famous government. So appointing the right person and then ensuring that they're rewarded or reprimanded by impartial standards is something that affects the entire organization or the entire state at large. And it's not simply just between friends. So, we can forgive our friends, but as long as they're not in a position, we're not a leader that then sort of appoints them in a position that affects other people with their actions. So that's the difference between a friendship and a sort of professional relationship. Similarly, we can see that even before the times of Taizong, there were many other leaders, very, very famous in the sort of early Chinese period. One of these was Duke Wen of Jing. So just this should be BCE. So it ruled in the 636 BCE. And essentially, he had been exiled for about 19 years from his state of Jing in the sort of spring and autumn period in China. And in that period of exile, he was supported by many sort of officials. And when he comes back and takes up his leadership role as the ruler of the state of Jing, people who have supported him in his years of exile are thinking about how they can be rewarded. Now, what happens is that he immediately rewards many people in order to sort of bring everyone close together and to ensure that he acknowledges their great contributions to their support, to his support for him in his time outside the state, but also in his rulership. And people are saying, well, there's a particular person, Tao Hu, who was very hardworking. He also followed the Duke during his time in exile, and yet he's not rewarded. Why was that? So this is how the Duke replies. He says, those who assisted me according to rightness and guided me according to ritual propriety. So these are two very important virtues from the Confucian perspective, rightness and ritual propriety. Rightness here refers to appropriateness of the situation, but also appropriateness in relation to humanity, or this idea of kindness. So the idea of kindness is important, or compassion, but it has to be measured in appropriate situations. And so, as a leader, you need your officials to help you make those decisions and weigh up the advantages and disadvantages of the course of action. So he's saying that rightness is very important, this idea of appropriateness in certain situations. And then at the same time, ritual propriety, which is the idea of how to ensure that there's harmony, how to ensure that different people are respected, people who are more senior, people who are more junior. How can I ensure that respect and harmony occurs throughout all my relations? So these are two very important virtues, and he says that the officials who were with me, who helped me by pointing out and providing strategies in accordance with rightness and ritual propriety, these are the people I've rewarded first. Those who taught me according to the good and fortified me with steadfastness, so these are people who just provided these general principles, these are the people I rewarded next. Now, this kind of teaching could be through example and words. So he's clearly sort of recognizing these are virtuous people. And third, those who opposed my wishes and repeatedly showed me the errors of my ways, and perhaps when he was thinking about his own self-interest over the state, over his responsibilities, well, these people stepped in and told him what was what, gave him honest feedback, told him the inconvenient truth at times, then these people also rewarded. So he had sort of cycles of reward to show people what he valued. And then he says, these are the three reasons one rewards meritorious ministers. And of course, if I was to reward hardworking soldiers, then Tao Hu would surely be at the head of the list. So people said, okay, well, why did you not reward Tao Hu? He's so hardworking. Well, the Duke says, yes, he's hardworking, but has he done any of the above? So someone who's hardworking, we would think that this is the person who should be rewarded, who should be given the first reward, because they've obviously put in a lot of effort for the state. But you can see how there's several, it's quite subtle. There are nuances to this reward, system of reward, and it's based on one's priorities as a leader, what one values over and above just simply service. So to say everyone in the organization or in the government is employed and they provide service, but what kind of service do you provide? Is it simply within your remit? Is it simply just doing your job day in, day out, making sure that you are fulfilling that job? Well, that is ultimately part of your task, part of your work. But it's different if you're able to provide strategy. You're able to help the leader think ahead and think about the appropriateness of their actions and how they can cultivate better relations, interstate relations in this case, or diplomatic or domestic relationships, then this is something that the Duke particularly valued. And he also valued teachers. So he valued those who taught him, who was able to guide him using virtue, so the so-called good, but also steadfastness, this idea of always adhering to the principles, showing him through their actions or their words. And why is it that that those who opposed my wishes, people who remonstrated, who provided this honest feedback, were sort of third in the round of rewards, was because these were people who waited until he made mistakes before they provided that feedback. So if they oppose my wishes, well, that's all well and good, but you should have actually prevented me from doing so in the very first place, prevented me from even having that inclination, that tendency, and talking about this really bad policy in the first place by guiding me with rightness, propriety, teaching me, etc., and not simply waiting until, I think of this very inappropriate policy before then opposing me and remonstrating. So, and then clearly, hard working is great, but the above. So you can see here that what the Duke valued was very clear in his cycles of reward and appointment. And as a result, the last paragraph in this particular record says that the scribes of the Joel kingdom actually predicted that the Duke would become a hegemon. So a hegemon in those days was someone who sort of led a very powerful state. So he became one of the most powerful states at that time in the history, that early history of China. And you can see that those scribes were able to predict that because he was very clear in what he wanted from his officials, what he valued, and the fact that he valued virtue over simply flattery or sycophancy. And that his reward system was clearly not based on emotion, and he was not partial to those who had simply served for a long time, like Emperor Taizong, but also he was not partial to just seeing that some people had been serving, that they were hardworking, but actually he valued other aspects of service, like providing, asking the right questions, providing good strategy and guidance. And because he valued that, then obviously the ministers, the officials would step up to the plate and provide that kind of service, that kind of guidance for him. So one needs to be very clear and consistent about what one values as a leader. And oftentimes that can be through words, but also it can be through one's actions, in the sense that, throughout your interactions with people, your subordinates, you're very clear about, and you demonstrate and you exemplify what it is that you value. And how does this relate to our lives today? Well, it's in the realm of what we call professional ethics, that leaders, any kind of leader, whether you're even a teacher as well, needs to ensure that criteria is made explicit, expectations are made clear. So here, this idea that subordinates, people in your team or in your students, deserve to know clearly what is expected of them. They shouldn't have to guess your expectations, because if they are unclear, they're ambiguous about it, you're constantly chopping and changing about what it is that you expect, then it leads to a sense of what's called in social psychology role ambiguity. And role ambiguity means that they're never really clear about what they need to do. And obviously then that leads to loss of confidence, high turnover, poor job satisfaction, substandard performance, sense of futility in what they do on an everyday basis. Are they meeting your standards? Are they going to get promoted, etc.? So you can see the value of being very clear. Now, this clarity, it says in the second point, needs to be particularly articulated. The performance indicators, criteria, etc., needs to be articulated at the outset of the professional relationship, but also really at the beginning of any kind of project. What is it that we want here? And if that's the case, there's a number of benefits, because if that is made clear, then as a superior, as the leader, you can use that then to evaluate your subordinates, evaluate the work that's happening at regular intervals. And you can really help everyone in the team to develop professionally, to develop according to these guidelines, according to these goals. And then it also helps you in providing timely and regular evaluations. So evaluations shouldn't just be made at the very end, but should be conducted periodically, so that you can help people in the team develop and give useful feedback. So you can see how something that happened with Duke Wen of the state of Jing, how that those principles can still be made relevant in our lives, in this idea of what we do in our professional relations. And it seems easy, but actually there are many challenges to making performance criteria explicit. So it might be difficult to do if, as a superior, you are yourself ambiguous and unclear about what the standards should be. And you're always constantly changing. Well, then that doesn't help you articulate it. The second challenge is if you're not clear about how to communicate it. You don't want to sort of be the bad cop and sort of make that clear at the outset. The third is probably more sinister, in the sense that some superiors, they have hidden agendas, and in that they're not transparent about what they expect, their expectations, and then if anything goes wrong, they're able to shift the blame onto subordinates. And so therefore they don't want to be too clear. So they want to protect themselves. And then ultimately, another reason is that the superiors themselves are unable to exemplify and achieve those targets themselves. So therefore, it's very difficult to ask of others. If you put that all together, so what is getting in the way of this objective sort of criteria? Giving objective criteria for others is thinking of oneself, really, isn't it? To conceal our own deficiencies. We're not clear about how to communicate. We're worried about what the other party might think about us. We ourselves are not clear about the criteria. All of these are our own deficiencies that we need to address before we can be very clear with others. And it's important that we make this a priority, because this is a way in which it shifts the focus not on ourselves and our deficiencies, but to shift the focus onto the subordinates and the people that we are responsible to. So we put their interests first. We think of what they need, how they can develop, how they can do better for themselves, but also for the organization at large in the state. So back to that first scenario, which is, if there's an objective criteria, what's preventing us from using it on an impartial basis? Well, from the anecdotes, it could be our personal interests, could be our emotions towards the other person, or it could be just ourselves and our own lack of performance or cultivation, that so much so that we don't we feel embarrassed to have to sort of articulate this for others, or we may not even know the standards ourselves. So that is the first scenario, and you can see that there's quite a few things getting in the way of appropriate, accurate reward and punishment. And then the second scenario is, well, what if there is no objective criteria? If you think that, we're not in a job situation, we don't have regular so-called meetings with some people, perhaps in a family relationship, how am I meant to act in certain situations? Perhaps there's no clear criteria, or is there? And in any situation where you think there's no objective criteria, actually the ancient Chinese traditions would beg to differ, in the sense that there's always that idea of moral ethics in all our relations. And this is where our understanding of ancient texts, like the太上感應篇, the Exalted Treatise, the Deeds of Grade, come into play. The thing is that these are objective criteria when it comes to how we deal with others. And it is reflected, or it comes back to us when we experience difficulties in relationships, when we experience so-called misfortune, when we don't get along with others, when problems in communicating, frustrations, etc. All of these things are reflections of the fact that we're not according with this kind of moral criteria. And sort of goes back to what Kelly mentioned last week about the studies on the deeds of grade, the guidelines for being a good person. And I want to share with you this other study. And it's about teacher and student relationships. It's about sort of how students, when they're young, get along with others. It was only published 2 years ago in the Journal of Moral Education. And basically, this particular study looked at over 200 students aged 10 to 13, so predominantly 12 years old, in the fifth grade, half female, half male. And these school children were randomly assigned to receive deeds of grade classes for 8 weeks. Now, the classes were not intense. They only had 45-minute class every Monday. And in these 45 minutes, the teacher would discuss the principles with them. They'd have role play. They'd write reflection diaries. And the following week, the teacher would come back and say, okay, well, were you able to put into practice? How did it go? So there was the sense that that 45-minute class every week was just to let them understand what was the moral criteria, you could say, objective performance indicators and criteria. And then they go off and then they do it and they measure themselves, they evaluate themselves. But actually, in a sense, everyone else is also evaluating, because it changes how they relate to others. So what happened was that they were evaluated in using sort of objective markers on the first pre-intervention, so before they studied the deeds of grade, after 8 weeks, and then after 16 weeks. So follow-up. And the measures were how they themselves reported how they felt about their relationships with friends. And these were measured by sort of psychological 2 different scales. Then the teachers reported about how the students were in behaving with others, how the so-called pro-social behavior, generally beneficial, helping out friends, helping out the class, etc. And this was on a child behavior scale. And then the 2 teachers themselves sort of evaluated the students on how they were using this teacher-student inventory. So these are all sort of quite well-studied, well-researched measures of behavior. And this was the result. So across all the 3 different measures, there was statistically significant improvement. Now, you might say, oh, it's not very marked, but certainly there was a difference that was statistically significant. So the experimental group versus the control group that had no, classes on Dieselway versus the classes on Dieselway. And so on all different aspects, how they dealt with their friends, how they dealt with the teacher, how the teacher observed them generally in the classroom, all improved. So when we think about it, this, if we go back to this idea of praise, blame, reward, and punishment, when we are in a position of authority, of power, in which we can supervise and evaluate others, then we need to do so according to the correct markers and criteria for our jobs. Outside of those professions, what are the markers? It's the moral standards that we read in the ancient texts, whether you're reading the Exalted Treatise, and in this particular part we're reading about the misdeeds, things to avoid, or the deeds of way, which sort of helps us understand, things to avoid, things, appropriate behavior in our relations with everyone around us, from the family to our friends. And these then become the markers. So in order to reward effectively, to praise and blame, or to help others improve, we need to have clear standards, whether it's in our work or outside of work. And this is where our understanding of these texts are quite important, because that helps us to value the right things, like the Duke, like Emperor Taizong, to value that virtue, that talent, over and above just simply emotion, or the idea that people are long serving, and therefore what they've done in the past, they deserve to be forgiven and pardoned. So the subjective voices of people around you, they essentially, there will always be people who say different things, but what is the standard? How do you know that you're doing the right thing? Is through the moral standards of these texts. So it's very useful and very helpful that we come together at least once every week to sort of revise our understanding and to sort of develop our understanding on these ideas, and ultimately then during the week think about how we can put them into practice. So thank you very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you very much.